countdown to the last comic shop in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hey, it is now time for the last comic shop,
where we open the shop up to newbies in order to help them find their way under the comic book tent.
And where we keep the lights on for those oldies and try to help those folks level up by, talking about comic books.
I'm the host with the most, Andy Larson. I'm joined by Jay Scott and Chad Smith. And of course, also on today's program, the wonderful Mikey Wood. And if you're wondering why I'm talking in such luscious low tones, it is because my in-laws are here at the last comic shop. Well, they're nearby the last comic shop, and I'm trying to be as quiet as possible. Hopefully everybody's enjoying it.
It's a very AM radio. I feel like we're going to go to a smooth jazz track from Kenny G at any moment.
Yeah. It's all NPR.
That it's very fitting that we're talking about in-laws, because today we're talking about a particular book that has a lot of familiar connections, as well as sci-fi ones as well. It's another Brian K. Vaughan classic, and that is, of course, Saga. Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples have been weaving quite the cosmic odyssey.
That's right. Yes. And didn't it hit around 54 issues before they took their break?
Yeah.
It's going to be restarting here in January, so now's the best time to get into this interfamily saga.
They were on hiatus for a while, and they've just come back, and we're only halfway through the story. And for those who don't know, and we'll get into this when we get into the book more, it's really the story of the baby, of the girl Hazel, her life. So we've gotten half of that, and we're getting the other half, probably her teen years. Sure to be exciting.
There you go. But for today's purposes, we're going to be reading through what was released as issues 1 through 18, also known as trades 1, 2, and 3, also collected as Saga Compendium Volume 1.
Now, Mikey, who we've had on this show quite frequently, and I will be very honest, is one of the biggest comic book aficionados I know. Like, he seems to have read everything. This was one book that he had not read, although he wanted to, right, Mikey? Where was the delay? Like, why of all the books you just never got around to Saga until today's program?
That's right, Andrew. And the reason is, honestly, I had the first trade, and it was just one of those things where I just got distracted by other stuff. I knew it was an ongoing kind of thing. I knew it was a big, long story. So I thought, you know what, I'll just hold off. Here's the thing about Saga that's kind of like, okay, so I read 16 issues in 2 days, and people were like, wow, that's a lot. It's actually not a lot, because it moves so fast. The dialogue is so snappy and so natural and so real that it just like pop, pop, pop. Every issue is kind of a fast read. There's times where I'd actually go back and say, was that actually 22 something issues? Like, it's quick, and I guess it's just because his dialogue style and the writing style is so, it doesn't feel stilted at all. People talk like people actually talk. It's a sci-fi book, but it could be anywhere. Like, they don't talk.
Let me put a pin in where you are, because I think we might actually be going too fast right now. Because before we get into the Saga talk, I wanted to go back. We were reviewing Why the Last Man recently. It's also written by Brian K. Vaughan. And when I read that, my issue with that book was that it was really, really dated. And then I remembered also with Brian K. Vaughan, a few years ago, we read Private Eye, which he did through that Panel Syndicate, it's an awesome book with Marcos Martin. But reading it also seemed kind of dated. But then think of Paper Girls, which he does with Cliff Chang. That's a great work that feels of a time, but it doesn't have that dated feeling. And I don't think Saga does either. So before we get into Saga itself, I'm curious if you guys can help me figure out what makes sci-fi seem dated. I think of the Star Wars movies. I think everybody universally appreciates the first 3 Star Wars movies, and then the sequels and prequels, people are like, yeah, they're okay, but like they don't really capture an audience like the first 3 did. What's the difference?
Well, those Star Wars movies, it's for a lot of us, it's when it hits us. Like, I don't care for the prequels whatsoever, but my nephew, those were his. Like, they came out when he was 5, 6, 7. I went to see the original Star Wars on my 5th birthday in 1978. So on a personal level and on a timing level, that might be important as to when things hit. And sometimes subject matter is important too. Like, you can look at Blade Runner, even though it takes place in 2019, which is 2 years ago. We don't have the flying cars. We don't have it, but it still doesn't matter. You don't sit there and you don't go, well, that never happened. It still feels like that is a version of 2019 that we just never saw. It's like everything feels lived in, futuristic, but plausible. I don't know. There's just, I think a lot of it has to do with that sort of thing. Horror movies are the same way. Like the whole slasher movie thing is pointless with cell phones, you know? It's like,
you know, obviously sensibilities change and what is construed as scary. Or I mean, I think, you know, if you look at the original Halloween, there's almost no blood in it, and it's all about suspense and allowing the mind to create the horror that you don't see on. And that's why Jaws worked so well. They couldn't get the shark to work, so they had to do it without the shark, and it actually made it more scary because your mind constructs. So, but to go back to your original question, why does some sci-fi work, or, you know, some of these horror movies work or whatever? I think it goes to themes. And the movies that work are the movies that go into universal themes. So it doesn't matter their time and place because they're sort of removed from a moment. And the sci-fi movies, the horror movies that are addressing like something that's going on in society at that moment, as opposed to a universal theme of society, that becomes quite dated then because, well, you know, we've overcome that issue or people have moved past that.
I think I'll add as well that I think in a previous show when we talked about Dune, House Atreides, and we were talking about the difference between, you know, that novel or that comic book adaptation and the original Dune, and I think J.A. made the point that like Dune was written by a fiction author who was writing science fiction versus somebody that was a science fiction writer writing science fiction. I think that plays into at least my opinion of some of the original Star Wars versus the prequels. And I think that some of the prequels, honestly, they become a little bit too sci-fi. You know, in the original Star Wars, there was, you know, almost like Zen philosophy when you were talking about the Force, and the Force was like, you know, something that you couldn't really comprehend. It binded people. It was like, obviously everybody got angry about midichlorians because they tried to give a scientific explanation for something that was really more of like a universal or thematic thing. And I think that's the tipping point sometimes. I think Saga works, you know, and I'll get to this in our review later. Because honestly, while everything is just batshit crazy in this, like you got people with wings and you got giant naked giants with huge, you know, and you've got other people that look like walruses. But at the same time, there's such a human element to all the dialogue that you almost forget about all the visuals. You kind of like say, okay, this is just dialogue that can exist anywhere.
Yeah. Some of the best sci-fi movies, if we think about them too, like Close Encounters or Alien or Blade Runner or the original Star Wars, or there's this vibe where it's like they don't waste time explaining the world to you. It just is. Like there's little hints to their history. They give you like a little bit of history of what's going on, but it's really just a world that's just there, and you're in the middle of it now, you know, so they don't.
I wonder too, by the time Saga is all said and done, if I'll get tired of that. Like right now I'm not. I'm 3 trades in and they keep bringing in new characters, and we'll talk about that soon enough, I'm sure. But like, I wonder if it's because I never bothered to watch Jaws 2 or 3 because they're supposed to be terrible. But you have seen all the Freddy movies, all the Jason movies, and like all the Star Wars movies. They just keep stretching ideas out in order to justify those movies. Like, oh, well, now we'll explain what midichlorians are. You know, now we'll explain what Freddy's childhood was. And like, the more you do that, the less of the magic you have, because like Jay was saying, you know, you're taking the unknown and making it known, and what fun is that when you know everything?
Right. Well, we'll get into a little bit more of this discussion right after these commercial breaks, so stay tuned for more of The Last Comic Shock. We'll actually be doing our review of the first 3 volumes of Saga, first 18 issues, or first book,
compendium,
whatever you want to call it, right after these messages. Stay tuned.
Coming to you live from whatever podcast you're currently listening to, it's your boy Jay West with my co-host Mac East from the We Get Dub podcast.
What up, nerds? It's me, Mac East, and we got a badass anime podcast for you. We got hot sauce, we got hot takes, we got booze and banter.
And you can listen to us on all major platforms.
The We Get Dub podcast hits harder than a Goku gut punch.
Hazel always knew there was something special about her cat Mooney, but she's still shocked when Mooney opens his mouth to tell her he's just had a vision. An ancient evil has awoken after centuries of sleep, and only one man can stop it. the legendary warrior Beowulf. Unfortunately, it's been over 1,000 years since he slayed a dragon, and he's been reincarnated as this guy. His name is Victor, and he's more unemployed millennial slacker than mighty warrior. Go to monarchpublishing.net for a free sample comic.
All right, we're back with more of The Last Comic Shop, and it is now time for our Read Pile Review. Yes, that wonderful time on every single show where we read a comic book this week, or in this case, several, and now we're going to tell you about it. And, of course, it is Saga, 18 issues, a.k.a. the first 3 volumes, a.k.a. the first book, however you want to slice it.
First compendium. So this is Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. They are the co-owners, the co-creators of this massive work. Brian K. Vaughan, obviously the writer. Fiona Staples did all the art and a lot of the lettering as well. And I would just say, as we get into this, and we'll talk about this, obviously, you know, Brian K. Vaughan is a big person in comics. I think Fiona Staples often gets a little bit of a short shrift when it comes to people talking about Saga because they see Brian K. Vaughan. I would say that she's, 80 or 70% of this book. She did all the creature design, all the props, all the starships. I mean, everything is coming from her, and it's a very distinctive style, and it really makes the book. Because she's also having to, not the ones we looked at so much because Hazel's pretty much a baby through the whole, but she has the task of basically drawing this girl through her life across, hundreds and hundreds of comic book pages and having to keep sort of a style that maintains. I mean, that has got to be hard for an artist over the years.
Yeah. And I will say this, that I think I've commented on this before, that there are some comic books, I'm really glad that they're comic books and not some other medium like television and movies, because despite the advancements in CGI that we've had over the years, I still feel that Saga is a story that's best told in comic book form, just because Fiona Staples has just like unlimited creativity with that character design and everything like that.
Oh, for sure. And those designs, they're just killer. Like when you see certain characters like the Stalk, how horrifying is the Stalk? Where it's this white spider lady, like, oh my goodness. It's absolutely terrifying. And then you have the giant ogre with the balls. We'll talk about that. But like, there's so many things where she has that knack of taking something that's just rooted in reality enough. Like, we know CRT TVs, and we know people that wear fancy regal costumes, but she puts them together, and it's like, what the hell is that? But consistently with these characters, it's like there's just enough there that you can be like, okay, I have a frame of reference, but then it's twisted in such a way that it's beautiful and horrifying and super intriguing at the same time.
Yeah, I think even in the first couple issues of this, there's like a big battle scene, and they've got these big giant like AT-ATs from Star Wars, except they're big giant turtles, and you're just like, sure, you potentially could put in a TV show or a movie, but like, why? When you have Fiona Staples being able to draw these wonderful images, just enjoy the comic book. And speaking of comic book, 10-cent synopsis, Mikey? What happens in these first 3 volumes of Saga?
Well, Saga is the continuing story of what happens when warring factions stop warring and start doing it.
True story.
Saga is the story of Hazel, who is the child of war. Two mortal enemies, are raised to be mortal enemies. 2 warring factions fall in love with each other and have a child, and everybody wants to kill them. That's basically Saga.
Yeah,
because they're different species too. He is of the horns.
That's right.
She's of the wings.
That's right.
They make a winged horned beast.
Like you can certainly look at it as sort of a metaphor for what happens in the Middle East and what happens anywhere. Anytime that you have 2 different peoples who have been, from the time they were born, told that they're supposed to hate each other, what happens when they look across the barbed wire and they just fall in love? Which
group gets the horns? Which one gets the wings, Mikey?
I don't know. But like, yeah, and it's touching.
Well, I mean, again, I think I want to follow up with that, Mikey, because again, this is your first time. This is actually the third or fourth time I've read these particular issues, at least, because I keep on needing to start over again as they add more. I'm like, wait a second, hold on, I got to go reread these old things because, like, I forgot what happened. You know, I'm on now book 6, and I'm like, I forgot what happened. But this was the first time you read it. Like, again, you've talked about how Brian K. Vaughan just writes this snappy dialogue, and it just seems to fly. But what were your other thoughts?
You know what I really dig too is like I really like how there's not actually a bad guy. There kind of is, but there's kind of not. Like there's all the people that are trying to hunt the family. Even those people have these moments where you're like, okay, I get it. Like I get them. Like I understand. You know, like the Will and how he is with Slave Girl or Sophie. And there's a lot of that. There's pretty intense moments and some scary moments and some violent moments. And then there's this one page with Sophie and the cat.
Lying cat.
Yeah, lying cat. And you know, lying cat is a cat that tells you if you're lying. So it kind of comes out of nowhere. It's kind of like in the middle of all this bonkers stuff with like walrus people, and which are adorable. Right. The walrus people are adorable. But there's this moment where it's just like, oh my God, it grabs you by the heart. And it's not like something we haven't seen before. You know, these stories are they're fantasy sci-fi kind of stories, and they sort of have tropes, and but it's how you mix it all together. Like, and I just want more. I want more and more and more and more and more. You know?
Yeah, and everyone has, you know, realistic motivations. There's not just some cookie cutter bad person or cookie cutter good person. Everyone's complex, and I think that's what helps. And I mean, the complexity might not be super complex. I mean, they're side characters you don't need to know 50 issues of backstory for. But, you know, we talked about good sci-fi. You just put in the world, and as you go through, you're almost like Hazel. I mean, Hazel is essentially the audience surrogate through a lot of the first couple of books. She's telling you about what the world is and what her parents are and why it's important to her, i.e. why you should care about it.
Yeah. This is going to make sense to anybody but me, but it sort of reminds me of Mad Max Fury Road, right? So Fury Road is like a 2-hour car chase. From the very beginning, it's like, boom, it is a car chase. And you find out everything that you need to know during the course of that car chase. They lay it all out for you. So by the end of the movie, you know who everyone was. You know what all of their motives were. You see their character arcs and where they start out and where they end. And it all happens during the course of and it's the opposite of something like Game of Thrones, which had things. Game of Thrones had something that I call sexposition. Not sexposition, but it's like they would give you all the exposition during sex scenes. Like people would be having sex with each other and talking about what's happening in the episodes, you know, because the audience needed that sort of feed. That doesn't happen. And I mean, sex happens, but like it's a grown-up story. It's not, Saga isn't for kids. It's a grown-up story, but it tells you everything you need to know when you need to know it as the story progresses, and that's super cool too.
I'm glad you brought that up, Mikey, because actually one of the parts of Saga that now that I've read it like 3 or 4 times is actually the same thought process. Not when I first watched Empire Strikes Back, but after like the 50th time I saw Empire Strikes Back, and I said to myself, you know what? This timeline doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, how is Luke as great of a Jedi as he is if he spends like, I don't know, 20 minutes on Dagobah? How are like Princess Leia and Han as close as they are when they're in the same clothes all the time? So what, have they been on the Millennium Falcon and the asteroid belt for like 2 days? All this like character developing drama is supposed to happen within the span of a week. And that's kind of the way I feel with Saga. I'm not going to give a lot of spoilers here, but there are characters in these books that meet each other, and I'm not going to say it's meet cute. It's like meet quick. Like, it's just like, okay, we got to get moving with this story. So like the Will and Gwendolyn, they're going to immediately have a connection. And they're not only going to have a connection, they're going to become like mom and dad to Sophie, like real quick. And it's just like, you know what? In real life, that happens after months or years. But no, we don't have that time. We've got days. And so the same thing happens here with Elena and Marco's dad. They meet each other. And they have like this like super great connection, yet they're only together with each other for like 2 days, it seems like. I don't know. Did anybody else have a problem with that?
I do not, and here's why. It's called Saga. When you want a saga, you want something that's grand and something that's epic. It's not called long, boring-ass story. It's Saga. And they've got all this different stuff going on, all these different machinations. And sure, sometimes the pace is heightened, but that's because in conflict, in times of great anxiety, in times of great pressure, like, that's where diamonds are formed. That's where, the juices are flowing. And so I don't care. It's like Mad Max. If you think Mad Max too much, none of it makes sense, but it doesn't matter because it's so cool and you know all the motivations of the characters and you can feel for all the characters as they come and they give you just as much as you need. And then there's guys on giant stilts flipping back and forth between cars and a guy with the fire guitar. And it doesn't matter. It's awesome.
Yeah, if you want that long transition from one moment to the other, I mean, go watch Silent Running, right? That's like the sci-fi version of the 1970s. You can watch Bruce Dern swim in the pond for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
I think what they're just getting rid of is the fact that it took a long time because they had no hyperspace to get from the asteroid belt to Cloud City, but they didn't show that. It's called editing.
Well, no, here's the thing, though. Stick with Empire Strikes Back just for a second. This is to credit Lawrence Kasdan and Irvin Kershner. You meet these characters and they're different. It's as if they have been with each other for a year and a half or so, like that. We didn't see it, but shit happened. And you also have people who are sort of thrown into a very tense situation to a point, are kind of exhausted of the whole war thing going on.
Well, I'm not going to say that I didn't like it. Like, I like Empire Strikes Back. I like Saga. I like the fact that, to Jay's point, they do some editing with the narrative. It's just, again, maybe that's like a key point of all good fiction, is like they don't waste time with like, hey, we all know that people develop these relationships over time. But yeah, we just want to fast forward that because all that's boring. Like, all that's boring. We don't need to tell you that. Just know that these people are now together and you should enjoy it. Right?
And when you're dealing with the Joseph Campbell, archetypal stories, we have that shorthand built in. We know about the young farm boy that's going to go on his quest. We know about the wizened people that are going to help them on their journey and that kind of stuff. I'm okay with them taking those shortcuts.
Sure.
But when I was looking at Saga, there were a couple of things that stood out for me, which I think we've talked about a little bit. But number one was ultimately it is a family drama. Everything relatable comes from that for me, where it's like you have in-laws, that are coming to visit, and like the lead characters, the parents end up having to deal with them, and like, oh geez, they're judging. You have the babysitter, who, by the way, is a ghost who only exists on the top half because the rest, who knows what happened. It's like the babysitter's part of a family, and those family dynamics, I think, are a great hook. But another thing I love about this book is how gross and depraved it is. Like, I don't think we've gone far enough into this stuff. Sometimes it's sexy in a weird way, like when they go to that sextillion planet and you have those legs and heads and like the will is there and they're like, we'll do whatever you want. And it's like, that's just what I wanted to hear. That's so gross. But at least they leave enough to the imagination. But then when they do decide they're going to cross the line, oh my goodness, do they leap over that line? They put you with the giant troll with his balls dragging on the ground. Mm-hmm. They give you those sextillion ladies with the heads. Oh, God, that freaks me out. That's going to be in my nightmares again. But
I kind of, it's funny because I wanted to mention this, and it sounds like I'm being silly, my usual self, but I'm not. I'm serious. I like the way that the couple's sexuality is portrayed in this book. Like, they sound like a real couple. They banter with each other. They say realistic, sweet-sounding things to each other that actual couples would say. They have, like, a sexual dynamic that's not... It doesn't feel like it's done for a shock value thing. It doesn't sound like it's done for just the sake of it.
It feels like a real relationship.
Yeah, it feels like very much so. as somebody who writes that kind of crap sometimes,
Sure.
it's hard to write people who don't sound like they're movie characters. Guy says the right thing at the right time all the time, that kind of stuff. It's hard to avoid that.
Well, I think that's a major reason why Saga does work and why the family dynamics come out. I think that's why a lot of people that I've shown this book to, my wife included, they've just come away saying, yes, I need to read more. I think it's because Brian K. Vaughan writes some of the best dialogue in comic books. Like, he sincerely does. Some of the lines in this, and he talks about, like, when the in-laws show up, it's like if there's a antithesis to the honeymoon, it's the week after you have your first baby, like where everything gonna go wrong will go wrong, and then the gawkers show up, the people that just want to pay their admission to see, oh, look at this young couple struggling so badly and how I'm not them. I mean, Brian K. Vaughan hits it like that. There's another scene where they go to the lighthouse and they're all hanging out together. And there's just this nice scene where the author Heist is sitting with Hazel on his lap and like other people are reading magazines. And if your childhood wasn't like pretty much this 90% of the time, then I feel sorry for you. Because it was just like
playing games and reading books and stuff.
Exactly. It was just people just enjoying just being in a very nonchalant manner. And those kind of lines, they really hit me. They really hit me. I understood what he was talking about. They made that personal connection to me, which, again, some science fiction does not ever make in a thousand.
They get it right from the opening where she's giving birth. And she's like, please, back away. I don't want to defecate on you.
Yeah. Vaughan, years and years ago, did a volume. He did a run on Swamp Thing. And it doesn't get a lot of, because Alan Moore, the whole Alan Moore thing sort of overshadows it, it overshadows anybody else who writes Swamp Thing. But his run on Swamp Thing was cool because it focused mostly on Tefe and family stuff. That even early on he did that kind of stuff. But I think this has more, for me, it has more staying power than Y did. Like, I read all the way through Y and I liked it a whole lot, but it doesn't stick with me. Some people Y sticks to and they love it and it's their favorite book that they've ever read, and that's good because you want that sort of dynamic between some things hit some people other ways and other people,
Right.
Who will Saga appeal to? I think it would appeal to sci-fi people. I think it would appeal to fantasy people. I think it would appeal to, because it's also funny, it's also horrific, it's also, I don't know, it's just
like soap operas. I think the difference between Y the Last Man and Saga is Y the Last Man is very small and very contained. And then you've got these little ingredients that you've put together, and then you're just seeing how the bread is getting baked, right? And Saga, as it goes, it just gets bigger and bigger, and you almost need a whiteboard or something to draw all these lines, these connections, these new characters. And as we talked about, when they come in, they're not like one-offs or analogous to anything else. They are completely formed, well-defined characters that then they're very important to the story and they grow. And as what Andrew said is like, well, I'm reading book 6, but now I got to go back and read books 1 through 3 again because I forgot all this. Because and if you want to say put a ding on it, or say, well, this is one of the issues with it, is that it is very dense and it gets denser because it expects that you've read what came prior. Right. It's not a book that you can just pick up midway through and start reading and kind of understand.
But not only are the characters so complex, but so many of them have backstories that are intertwined. And it's kind of like that old thing with Wolverine back in the day in Marvel Comics, where Wolverine would bump into a character and he's like, we haven't seen each other for a while. And you're like, when the heck did you hang out with Wolverine? There's so many of those connections between characters. Like, the Will was in the relationship with the Stock, and Gwendolyn shows up and she meets the Will, and like all that stuff is going on. And there's so many layers of complexity, but it's all stuff that it makes sense. It tracks, and it makes it a really intriguing story because you want to know more. You want to find out where these people are going to go, what's going to happen.
Yeah. And like Fiona Staples, like in her artwork, it's weird because there's horrific, like nasty stuff, but it's so pleasant. I don't understand, like It's you know what I mean? It's like it's really
yeah.
beautiful, and it's not like if you look at some of the backgrounds are almost abstract periodically, but it's pretty. I can't say enough about this book. I'm kind of glad I waited as long as I did, to be honest with you. But
all right, well, I hope that our listeners won't have to wait very long for our rating section. That'll just be here in another minute, so stay tuned. Maybe that'll be a boring section because it seems like we all liked it, but we'll see. Stay tuned.
Has this ever happened to you? You're in bed, drifting off, and suddenly think,
who would win in a tug-of-war match between Superboy and Merlin?
did Marvel ever try to make a long-haul trucker into a superhero?
How would it work out if I named my dog after a D-list supervillain?
The answers in order are Merlin.
Yes.
And amazing.
I'm Jessica.
And I'm Mike.
And we host the podcast 10 Cent Takes, a show that looks at weird, silly, and cool moments from comics and how they're woven into the larger fabric of history.
Moments like the time Superman shilled for Radio Shack.
When Archie got tempted by the devil.
Oh, and then there was that time that DC Comics gave a superhero AIDS in an effort to be topical.
It's always weird around here, but we'd like to think it's also interesting.
So come with us and commit random acts of pop culture archaeology, one issue at a time.
If you'd like to learn more, head over to 10centtakes.com.
All right, we're back with more of The Last Comic Shop, and it is now time for our ratings, where we hope to not make a saga out of this section, because we got to get to our recommendations eventually. And I think if we gushed any more about Saga, it would make for a boring show. So maybe these ratings, they're what you expect. But J.A., what's our 1 out of 4 scale for this week?
This is very appropriate. So that means our ratings will have to be spot on, because we're going to go 1 out of 4 lying cats.
Lying. That is one of the best characters in this entire series. And that's hard to say because there's so many, but he's like the Chewbacca. Like, you just wait for Lion Cat to come back on. He's a breath of fresh air with his telling it how it is. In any case, we're going to go ahead and start off with our Saga Virgin, which was Mikey Wood on this week's show. So how many lying cats are you giving it, sir?
It's the only thing I'm a virgin of. I'm giving it, how many is the top that we can give it? 4? 4. That's what I'm going to give it. There's not anything I didn't care for, honestly. What's funny is I'd mentioned a couple of times how fast it is. It's weird because it's fast, but it's a slow burn. It's like... It almost feels like not a lot happens, but a lot does happen. I don't know how to explain. It's the quickest I've ever read through that many pages, and then stuck with me.
Well, the one question I did have for you, Mikey, is, and I think on previous shows you said that you didn't like the Star Wars prequels because it seemed like George Lucas just made everybody go to high school together. They just knew each other, and that happens a lot in Saga. So, like, for example, like the Will meets Gwendolyn, who happens to be Marco's ex, and all this other stuff. So it's got those soap opera aspects. What makes this one different than the prequels, I guess?
The relationships are better. So I can almost get past it because, you're talking about, like, same thing happens in every single D&D game that ever happens. Everybody meets at the same pub. Oh, you just happen to be at the same pub, You happen to be at the same. So you have to get the characters together somehow.
Right. Maybe it's just these are characters you wanted to meet. These are characters that you wanted to see.
These are characters where it makes sense that they know each other. There's no reason that C-3PO had to be built by Darth Vader. There's none. 0.
That is a very good answer.
Yeah.
All right. Chad, how many lying cats are you giving this?
Okay, so I will say, if there's one ding I would give this book, it's that it is for mature audiences. And not just because it has weird sexy parts or gross parts, but because this is a book that I feel like, I don't know if our average 18-year-old audience member would appreciate this book as much as somebody who's lived a little bit of life. Like I was talking about that scene earlier where the opening scene where they're giving childbirth and the pooping during childbirth. Now that I'm a parent and I know, like, that's a thing that can happen. Like, those are things that, like, there's a certain maturity level that, like, helps me to appreciate this book all that much more. There's just so many things in here that make it that much fun. But I want to make sure audiences are clear. This is not for the kiddies. Pick it up once you've gone down the road a little bit, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But I did want to mention, too, Mikey was talking about Fiona Staples' art. I think Fiona Staples is the best kind of comic artist. Her faces and her gestures are so good and so close to realistic. But at the same time, she pulls enough back in the cartooning aspect. It's not photorealistic at all. Like, There's enough room for the beauty of the line work to breathe. And we talked about the character designs. You can't give Fiona Staples enough credit for this. It's really great. And for me to give this book anything other than a 4, the Lion Cat would come out and say I'm lying. So 4 out of 4 Lion Cats.
All right, J.A. This is one of your babies. How many Lion Cats you giving it?
So, this is the book that got me back into comics.
Very cool.
I hadn't read comics in years, and you guys had started up a previous podcast, and I think I had come on mainly to talk about the pop culture aspects around comics, Marvel, movies, and whatnot. And I forgot how I came across it, and I just read one, and then I was emailing Andrew and saying, do you have more of this? I want to read more of this. He gave me the first 5 books. I ended up reading all 9 up to that point that had been published. So I obviously really, resonated with me. And to Chad's point, it is something for people who have been there, done that a bit. I don't want to say you can't read it if you're not a parent or you're not older, but I do think that if you're post-college, in your 20s and your early 30s, you're going to take more out of it than if you're a 17-year-old who hasn't really experienced a lot of that life yet. If I would ding anything, I would say it gets a bit stereotypical that the last page of every book is a jump cut to a cliffhanger that you've got to wait for the next book. But that just makes you want to keep reading, so it's not that much of a bad thing. I don't know, some could argue that that's just lazy writing. But,
what? That's exciting writing. Saga, man, Saga!
Right. And to go into the characters, because we didn't talk about it at all, and that's when I read it for the first time. Okay, the guy's got ram horns and she's got little cute wings. That's kind of stuff that we've seen before. But have you ever seen a robot prince with a television head?
Right.
A CRT head.
Some orgies with his platoon.
At that point, I was like, wow, this is weird, and I like it. So Lion Cat would be calling me out as well if I said anything less than 4.
Okay. I think if I had rated this the first time or the second time that I read through it, I think I would have been lying if I didn't say that it was a 4 out of 4. But I think that, honestly, I'm going to ding it slightly. I think I'm going to be the outlier and give it a 3.75 at this point. And the major reason is no, it's because in reading through the first 3 volumes again, I don't like the fact that people that you're supposed to be invested in die so quickly. There are a lot of people in the first 3 volumes that you get to meet for like 2 or 3 issues, and then they immediately die. And sometimes very like, whoa, that happened? I'm not going to tell you who they are. But there's one in particular that just happens on a panel, and you're just like, really? That guy died? Like, just, okay, fine. Like, I was just getting used to that character. I liked that character. I don't like the fact that he's dead. And I think there was more story to tell with him. And where's that story? No, they're going to bring in new characters. And so I didn't like that. I felt like, unlike Star Wars, where I got the same characters and they showed up and they stayed there, Saga just kept on giving me new characters and then taking them away. And I was just like, that gets old after a while. So 3.75 for me.
To your point, though, I don't think they've taken them away. They've just moved them around the chessboard a bit. It's sort of to your comment that it's a bit like Hickman. And it goes to all those comments you said about characters being killed and coming away and coming back and going away and coming back. So I think some of it is we just got to see how it all plays out. Like, they killed the Stalk very early on. But then she comes back all the time in flashbacks. Does that make you wish that she wasn't dead? Because now all you can do is see her in flashbacks. But the flashbacks are wicked scary because there's the one where she's like, it's a dream and her body's closing in on itself. And it's like stitched up where the energy blast blew her heart out.
Well, as I said, that's why you can tell that like Brian K. Vaughan worked on Lost, because they used to do that stuff with Lost all the time. And it drove me nuts there, too. And speaking of Hickman, we've said it on the show before that Hickman is really good at sticking landings when it comes to a big, long story arc. And that's what Brian K. Vaughan's got to do with Saga eventually. And we'll see what happens with the second half of this series coming up soon. It could be like Lost, where that didn't stick the landing either. And everyone was like, what the heck did I just invest all this time in?
I love Lost Ending. But anyway. Yeah, oh, you know what I forgot to mention that was cool too? Blue Speak is really neat. It's actually Esperanto, in case you're curious. You could actually translate their Blue Speak by using an Esperanto translator, so that's kind of cool.
Well, one thing that we're going to translate for you is where to find great comic books with our recommendations. Yes, every single show we give you other comic books that you should check out in addition to Saga, because again, we all gave a glowing review, so you should check it out. But yeah, recommendations.
So we try to give you something similar, something recent, something a bit out of left field or off the beaten path, though usually they all kind of are related to what we just read. And because we've got Mikey Wood on the show, he's the cherry on top. So he gets to recommend anything. And usually the recommendations are pretty good. So you owe it to yourself to stick around. Why don't we start out of field, maybe, or recent? I don't know. We'll find out from Chad.
There we go. Okay, so mine happened one day. I wandered into the local comic shop, and what did I see? I saw a comic book for Batman, the Audio Adventures. And I thought, oh, that's neat. They're doing a Batman comic that's like an old-timey radio serial. But what I realized was that comic book was an advertisement for a podcast. And that podcast was something that appears on a video streaming service. It doesn't really do podcasts. But that video streaming service is promoting this podcast in this comic book about a comic book character named Batman. And it was super weird, and it blew my mind. Because written and directed by David McNicholas, who is a Saturday Night Live writer, it has tons of SNL alum. You've got Chris Parnell, who, if you're an Archer fan, he's the narrator. You've got Jason Sudeikis, that's right, Mr. Ted Lasso himself is the mayor. Kenan Thompson is Commissioner Gordon. You get people like Brooke Shields coming in as Vicky Vale. Ike Barinholtz as Two-Face. Jeffrey Wright as Batman. Seth Meyers is on the show. Alan Tudyk. You get all these famous people. They're on this streaming podcast, which is 10 episodes on HBO Max, which you can't listen to anything beyond the first 2 episodes on a podcast provider because modern media doesn't make sense. But they also had a pretty cool comic book written by other comedians, like people like Paul Scheer, Bobby Moynihan, and has art by people like Jay Bone. There's a good chance you might be able to track this down at your local comic shop. It's Batman, the Audio Adventures. It's all really weird, and I don't understand how media works anymore and why people from Saturday Night Live are making a Batman podcast that's like, it's a radio drama. It's not like super duper funny, but there are parts that are funny. But like, why is this happening? And why is it happening on HBO Max? You know, isn't Saturday Night Live NBC and Peacock? Like, so, what is going on?
So my only question is, if you get 5 proofs of purchase, do you like get a mail away action figure?
There's nothing to purchase other than this comic book that, like I said, I just stumbled onto. But it's neat that it's happening. This might be the future. We might stumble into comic books that are advertisements for comics that are advertisements for a streaming show. It's actually a podcast on the streaming video service. It's actually advertising a comic book character that brought us to the comic book shop in the first place.
All right. Well, I think I'm going to go next, and I'm going to provide us with a similar pick. Again, I think they're all similar on today's program, but I wanted to talk about one of my favorite sci-fi related superhero comics. It was one that I really grew up with, and at a recent show, I was able to track down the original Nexus. Yes, the original Nexus graphic novel, which was, again, by the wonderful Mike Baron with Steve Rude art. Still one of my all-time favorite artists. And for those folks that have never experienced Nexus before, it really is the story of a somewhat adult version of Space Ghost, because he's basically a superhero that exists in space. He has weird dreams in which he has to go and avenge and kill horrible people in the universe using these godlike powers, which evidently destroy suns. So it's really weird. But he has all these folks that he saves from various planets, and they come to live with him, and they've got to set up a government, and the one guy's named Dave. Everything kind of turns sideways when a reporter named Legia comes to kind of investigate what's going on with this mysterious character known as Nexus. And they fall in love as they do, and you get a little bit of his origin story and how his dad used to be a dictator and all this other stuff, but now he's got to avenge the universe. And you read it for the Steve Rude art, I won't lie, because it's just absolutely gorgeous. Even though it's of the early 80s, it's got a timeless quality to it that it's just clean, it's crisp, it's wonderful to look at. So if you like superheroes, yet you want to make that jump over to a sci-fi comic, I think Nexus is a good place to start because it kind of melds those two things really well together.
Well, since you went from superhero to sci-fi, I'm going to go from sci-fi to superhero with a recent book by Jason Aaron and Dennis Hallen with art by Stephen Green. This is Sea of Stars. Basically, it's what happens when a recently widowed space trucker decides that he wants to get away from it because his wife has passed, so he's going to take this job as a long-haul space trucker. And nothing ever happens in space. It's boring. You're just long-hauling it across the universe, so might as well bring your kid along. We all know what happens then. Within the first 2 pages of the first issue, a giant space whale attacks them, and this kid starts to manifest power. And then you get some talking space monkeys who ride space dolphins, and it's just fun and exciting, and it's sort of like the never-ending story mixed with something that Miyazaki would come up with.
Ah.
And unlike Saga, and it's good for all ages. So this is one that you can share with your budding space pirate 10-year-old.
Oh, very cool. All right, Mikey, what's the cherry on top this week?
It's almost the R-rated version of J.A.'s pick, really, if you kind of think about it. I'm doing Fear Agent by Rick Remender and Tony Moore and Jerome Opena. But it's phenomenal. It's the story of Heath Houston, and he's a space, I guess a bounty hunter or like an exterminator. I don't know. It's hard to explain. But it's rollicking, good, fun space adventures. There's many volumes. There's also Tales of the Fear Agent. I have the 2 gigantic fat hardcovers signed by Tony Moore. Yeah, it's just a fabulous book, and everybody should read it.
Yeah. I can't agree more. I mean, that was the first time that I was introduced to Rick Remender as a writer. And again, it was really weird because I came into that thinking it was going to be just like a Ash Williams from Army of Darkness meets Flash Gordon, because he was kind of like a heavy drinker.
Yeah.
You know,
that's accurate. Yeah, that's accurate. Yeah.
And instead, it the further that series goes on, just like the more and more crazy it gets, but at the same time also in some ways depressingly bleak. Sisyphus pushing the stone up the mountain. Like everything that happens is just like, oh my gosh. And by the end of it, you're just like, thank goodness this is over, because you need that conclusion to this story, because again, lots of bad stuff happens to Heath Houston.
Yeah, he goes through a lot.
It's
got
just
aliens and monsters and ray guns and all that wonderful, beautiful stuff.
You just have it is truly R-rated. It is not for the kids for sure. Yeah. But one thing is for all ages is always The Last Comic Shop. We try to bring you comic book reviews every single week that appeal to all kinds of folks, whether it's, again, a show with Saga, or whether it's a show like last week when we did Panel Pals with Batman Fortnite 0 Point. Like, we always got something for you. So keep coming back. And you can do that by rate, reviewing, and subscribing over at www.lastcomicshoppodcast.com. It's a terrific place where you can find all of those variety of outlets that we will show up weekly. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and Google Play and Stitcher and Spotify and iHeartRadio and YouTube and Pandora and Amazon Podcasts and a variety of other places. And if you are nice enough this holiday season, make sure that you get out to one of those places and leave us a 5-star review. We would really appreciate that present to keep our Yuletide spirits bright.
There you go. And if you want to continue the conversation about any of the books that we've been talking about, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Last Comic Shop, on Facebook at Last Comic Shop Podcast. Or if you're not sure where those places are, you can always go back to www.lastcomicshoppodcast.com. Well, what else can they find there, J.A.?
We've got links to our merch store where we've got a special, our Christmas-themed Last Comic Shop t-shirt is now available. So make sure that you get them as a stocking stuffer. Perfect for the comic book lover in your life.
Ooh, that's right.
And while we might be the Last Comic Shop Podcast, we actually don't want to be the last comic shop. So we encourage you guys to go out to your local comic shop. If you need help finding a place like that, you can go to the Comic Shop Locator at www.comicshoplocator.com, where you might find a place that stocks Saga by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples, or a place that stocks Nexus by Mike Barron and Steve the Dude Rude. Or you might be able to find Sea of Stars, or Batman, The Audio Adventures, a comic book. Maybe you want to listen to the podcast on HBO Max. Maybe you want to figure out how the heck media works and explain it to me. I'd appreciate it. Or you could always just go back and check out Fear Agent, which will be waiting for you at your local comic shop as well.
And what we wish was at comic shops, but unfortunately isn't, is the wonderful work of Mikey Wood. He is a tremendous Pittsburgh comic book creator, and his work is available, though, online. So, Mikey, where can they find your work every single week?
Well, you could order the 2 trade paperbacks of a comic series I did 9 million years ago on Amazon. You just one's called Hate Your Friends and one is called Pack of Lies. You could also read some fun stuff on graphite.com, such as El Phantasma. And recently I saw a couple of like the ashcan versions of Hate Your Friends on eBay for like a lot of money. And I thought that was kind of cool. I don't know if they sold or not, but I'm not seeing any of it, but, you know, that was kind of neat. It's kind of cool.
Secondary market, Mikey. Secondary market.
Somebody's like, these have to be worth something, you know?
Well, in case we don't see you before then, happy holidays, Mikey Wood. Thank you so much for coming on to one of our shows around the Christmas season and spending some time talking comic books with us. We hope to have you back again in the upcoming year. And until next week, I'm the host with most, Andy Larson. I was joined by Chad Smith and Jay Scott, as well as Mikey Wood. And until next week, stay safe, stay sheltered, and remember, if you happen to land on a planet filled with trolls with giant dragging ball sacks, remember, it is actually just an egg of an even bigger monster that might swallow you up whole.
Yeah. So don't complain about the giant ball sacks, because there's always something worse, as my daddy always said.
The Last Comic Shop was a 2021 Black Angus production.